When Lindsay Hawker finished college, she was eager to explore the world. Her adventure began in Tokyo, but no one would have predicted that Tokyo was also where it would end, with her mutilated body found buried in a sand-filled bathtub on an apartment balcony. Bill, the head of a driving school, and Julia, a policy advisor for Transport for London, had been blessed with 3 girls. Lindsay was the middle daughter of the 3, including her younger sister Louise and older sister Lisa. They were a close-knit, hard-working family. Lindsay had just earned a biology degree from Leeds University, and she was ready to branch out and see the world. After conducting thorough research, she had fallen in love with the idea of teaching English in Japan. Bill and Julia were apprehensive to see her go. Perhaps their instincts were telling of the unimaginable events to come. Nevertheless, they let 21-year-old Lindsay start her adventure, despite their reservations. Just before Lindsay was set to travel to Japan, her older sister Lisa reminded her to be careful. "Remember Lucy Blackman," Lisa had said. It was a haunting thought, as the story of Lucy was tragic. Also a young Brit eager to see the world, Lucy and a friend worked as hostesses at an exclusive Tokyo nightclub that was frequented by wealthy businessmen. One such man took 21-year-old Lucy out on a private date. Sadly, that was the last anyone ever saw of her. Even more disturbing than her disappearance, her remains were located 7 months later. Her body had been dismembered and buried in a shallow cave. With this warning, Lindsay traveled to Tokyo a few months later in October of 2006 and began her job at Nova Intercultural Institute, a reputable English-language school. Lindsay settled right in with her 2 flatmates who were also teachers at the school. She quickly became absorbed in her work, and she grew to love Japan. In fact, she felt even safer there than she did in Britain. In December of 2006, a few months into Lindsay's Tokyo adventure, her parents and younger sister Louise visited to celebrate Lindsay's birthday with her. They explored her favorite locations and enjoyed a celebratory dinner at a sophisticated, world-renowned bar. And though they knew it was a very special experience, only time would reveal how much they would eternally cherish the memory of that night and what would be Lindsay's last birthday. As they continually observed Lindsay's friendliness towards strangers, her father had an uneasy feeling. He mentioned his concern to Lindsay, but she brushed it off. After all, she was the English teacher, and she wanted to fit in. Would Lindsay's innate trust in strangers indirectly lead to tragedy? Lindsay came to love her new job so much that she and her boyfriend of 4 years, Ryan Garside, made plans to spend the upcoming summer together. They would save funds for their upcoming plans to travel the world. In fact, they planned a full year of travels before they would return to Britain, where Lindsay would resume studies with plans of becoming a doctor. Sadly, the plans would never come to fruition. Everything went horribly wrong on the evening of March 25, 2007, when Lindsay's flatmates realized she hadn't come home since she'd left earlier that morning. It was not like Lindsay to disappear for any period of time, let alone to spend the night away. The following day, staff at the school placed a call to Lindsay's father and alerted him that Lindsay had missed 2 days of teaching without contacting the school. Something was clearly wrong. Just 5 days before she was last seen alive, Lindsay was enjoying time with friends at a favorite local bar she was known to frequent. According to the owner, a fellow Brit, Lindsay wasn't a big drinker by any means. She always headed home early. The bar was just a means to watch football in the company of friends. Like any other evening, Lindsay grabbed her bike and headed home. However, it would soon be discovered that someone had been watching Lindsay. Back at her flat and in the company of a roommate, Lindsay heard a knock at the door. She answered and found a young Japanese man who wished to take private English lessons from Lindsay, and at his request, Lindsay allowed the man inside the flat. During a somewhat strange interaction, the man drew a picture of Lindsay, and on the paper he included his phone number and his address on the back. At the time, no one could have possibly known how significant that piece of paper with the bizarre drawing would soon prove to be. Lindsay had agreed to provide the English lessons. Still, the man gave her a feeling of uneasiness, but she couldn't turn down the chance to make some extra money for her upcoming travel plans. But Lindsay was smart. She would only teach him in a public place for safety purposes. On the morning of Sunday, March 25th, Lindsay left her flat and headed to a coffee shop near the man's apartment in the town of Gyotoku. Footage shows Lindsay entering the shop behind a man. Lindsay appears quite uncomfortable as she frequently adjusts her hair. Lindsay's frequent touching of her hair and face could be a self-soothing behavior because she might feel uneasy or nervous. She left the shop ahead of him and got into a taxi with him. They headed back to his flat in order for the man to get money to pay Lindsay for the lesson. As they pulled up to his apartment, Lindsay asked the taxi driver to wait, as she'd be back momentarily. Tragically, it appears it had been an elaborate trap, and she would never make it out of that apartment alive. The taxi driver waited several minutes, then went on his way. The following day, Lindsay was reported missing. That's when the authorities utilized the crucial information from the strange drawing found at Lindsay's flat. Several police officers responded to the address, which belonged to a man identified as Tatsuya Ichihashi. He politely answered the door of the apartment, but then promptly fled. And then they found her out on the balcony. It was unbelievably horrific. Lindsay had been buried in a bathtub, one hand partially protruding from the combination of sand and dirt. She was barely recognizable. Her long hair had been shaved off, her body bound and terribly beaten, her neck broken. What kind of monster could have done this to Lindsay? The details that would unfold were unfathomable. Tatsuya was the prime and only suspect, yet the case was quite puzzling on the surface. The 28-year-old was an unemployed child of wealthy and successful parents who gave him a generous monthly allowance. His father was a brain surgeon and his mother was a dentist. He didn't seem like the type of person to do something like this, or did he? A parasitic lifestyle is a trait of a psychopath, along with having a lack of realistic long-term goals. Psychopaths also have a proneness to boredom, which may lead them to commit crimes for the thrill of it. There had been a sign that something was wrong when Tatsuya was 13. In school, he was assigned to write about his dreams for the future. According to a friend, he wrote in great detail about his fantasies of spying on girls as they dressed. A week after Lindsay was last seen alive, her father made an appeal to those in Japan in an attempt to seek information. He cited the murder as a source of shame on the nation, and it seems his appeal was somewhat successful. A short while later, the police released the video footage of Lindsay's last moves to TV stations. Around 2 weeks after Lindsay's murder, it's believed that Tatsuya phoned his parents, only to let the line go dead upon his father's answer. But the message was clear that he was still alive, despite rumors supported by the media that he had taken his own life. There were countless other speculations. Some wondered if perhaps he was involved with the Japanese mafia known as the Yakuza. It was believed that he idolized the violent gangs, but the idea didn't seem plausible to crime experts. What happened to Lindsay wouldn't have been worth the consequences for the Yakuza. Others theorized that he was able to evade capture because he was living in Tokyo's red light district, dressing in disguise as a woman. In late October of the following year, Lindsay's family received devastating news. Tokyo police planned to reduce their team of 140 officers assigned to Lindsay's case. Considering Japan's geography that included mountains and remote wilderness, they presumed Tatsuya would never be located. But after the setback came a major development. On November 10, 2009, police were contacted by a ticket officer at Osaka Ferry Port, stating an individual that resembled Tatsuya had purchased a ticket for Okinawa. Police quickly approached and questioned the man. He finally folded. With 3 words, the search was finally over. "I am Ichihashi," he said. Bill's instincts had proven true. Tatsuya had been hiding in plain sight all along. Evidently, he'd been working in construction during his months at large. As a loner, he seemed to have mastered the art of blending in. But how had he evaded capture for so long? As the story would unfold, the strangest twist of all would soon be revealed. Tatsuya had performed plastic surgery on himself. He'd sliced off part of his lower lip using a pair of scissors, removed molds from a cheek using a box cutter, and gone so far as to perform a nose job on himself using a needle and thread. In addition to his DIY plastic surgery, he'd saved funds from his jobs and underwent 2 professional procedures that included nose jobs, altered eyelids, cheek implants, and lip thinning treatments. Changing his appearance was the ultimate deception and con, which are 2 traits of psychopathy. Ironically, the very procedures that were intended to hide his identity would lead to his capture. It was a plastic surgeon, the second one to be precise, who set things in motion. The surgeon became suspicious of the man who wished to radically change his appearance. Police were alerted, and a photo of his altered face was issued. Within a matter of days, he was apprehended at the ferry terminal in Osaka. Lindsay's family and friends were relieved the suspect had finally been arrested, but it would not be until early July of 2011, nearly 2 years after his capture, that he would stand trial. At trial, Lindsay's parents and sisters listened as Tatsia described the horrors Lindsay endured during her last hours in that apartment. She'd followed him from the taxi to his front door and waited as he grabbed her payment for the English lesson inside his home. But then he told how he'd punched her and dragged her into his flat. He confessed to assaulting Lindsay. However, he did not admit to intentionally killing her. He claimed it was an accident. He panicked and inadvertently suffocated her when she screamed out for help, out of fear someone might hear her. It seems unlikely that Tatsia would have allowed Lindsay to leave after assaulting her, as she would easily be able to identify him and even provide his address to authorities. He may have been downplaying her murder in an attempt to receive a lesser sentence. Lindsay's family requested the convicted murderer be punished at the maximum penalty allowed by Japanese law. Japan does have the death penalty, which is execution by hanging. It's generally reserved for only the most heinous of criminals, and unlike in the US, it's extremely rare in Japan to be sentenced to death for only killing one person. The sentence came just days after the verdict was reached. Nearly 4.5 years after Lindsay's murder, Tatsuya was sentenced to life behind bars. Some red flags to look out for. The first warning sign was that Tatsuya showed up uninvited to Lindsay's door, which suggests that he may have followed her home. The drawing Tatsuya did of Lindsay could be interpreted as flattering or charming, but it seems like a strange thing to do the first time they met. But since there isn't anything overtly sinister about a drawing, Lindsay may have brushed this odd event off. Lindsay allegedly felt somewhat apprehensive about providing lessons to Tatsuya. However, she decided to meet with him anyway, as she may have felt there was no logical justification for refusing. She took precautions such as meeting him in a public place, but he then convinced her to go to his apartment. Although she may not have felt entirely comfortable with this, it's possible that she justified to herself that she could still take safety measures, such as public transportation, and then just waiting in his doorway for him to get the money. How to avoid similar situations. If someone is pressuring you to meet at their home or in another private place when you don't feel comfortable, do not give in to their demands. Tatsuya manipulated Lindsay into going with him in order to get money he owed her. If you're in a similar situation, remember that no amount of money is worth putting yourself in a potentially dangerous situation. It can be difficult to justify making a decision based on something as small as having a bad feeling about someone. However, it's important to always trust your gut. Ashley Freeman was celebrating her 16th birthday with her best friend Loria Bible. Though the night started with pizza, then a slumber party at Ashley's family farm, it ended in tragedy, with a fire that destroyed the Freeman's home. When the flames were finally extinguished, there was no sign of either girl. Ashley and Loria enjoyed a festive start to their evening on December 29, 1999. After dinner out, they continued the celebration at the Freeman farm along with Ashley's parents, Kathy and Danny. In the very early morning hours of the following day, a call came into the Welch, Oklahoma Fire Department. Firefighters arrived at approximately 5:30 a.m. shortly after the call came in to find the Freeman mobile home completely engulfed in flames. Inside, the remains of Kathy were located. But where was Danny? And where were the girls? The following day, one of the questions would be answered in the most horrific of ways. The scorched body of Danny was discovered in the debris. Sadly, it was Loria's parents, Jay and Lorene, who found the charred remains that police hadn't been able to locate the previous day. But the girls were still nowhere to be found. Loria's car was parked out front, the keys in ignition, but how had they disappeared without so much as a trace? A search party gathered and combed through the premises over the 2 days that followed. Among the findings was an insurance verification card, but the name on the card wasn't familiar. Loria's purse was also found amongst the ash and debris that had once been a home. Autopsies of Danny and Kathy were performed by the Oklahoma Medical Examiner's Office. The findings were unsettling. Each had suffered an execution-style gunshot wound to the head. The state fire marshal later inspected the site and concluded that it had been deliberately set. No surprise there. Authorities soon inferred the killings had been drug-related. According to multiple accounts, Danny was associated with the drug community. Over the following years, police continued to investigate leads, but each proved to be a dead end. Then, in 2005, there was a major development in the case. Authorities had zeroed in on a man by the name of Jeremy Jones. The 41-year-old was a convicted killer located on death row in Alabama. Coincidentally, records showed that Jones was arrested in the early morning hours of December 30th, 1999, the day of the fire. Complaints included public drunkenness and drug paraphernalia possession. The arrest occurred just 18 miles from the location of the Freeman home. Were authorities on the brink of solving the case? Then it happened. Jones confessed to killing Kathy and Danny Freeman and setting their home ablaze. The deadly confrontation had been the result of an attempt to collect on a drug debt. He said that he hadn't expected to find anyone else at the home, and the girls had taken him by surprise. He then took the girls to Galena, Kansas, shot them, and threw their bodies into an abandoned mine shaft. Finally, this case was on its way to being solved, but there was one thing missing: the girls' bodies. Soon after the confession, authorities coordinated a search of the mine shaft. Unfortunately, the search was unsuccessful. There was still no trace of the missing girls. Then, Jones recanted his confession, and authorities were once again back at square one. It may seem surprising that someone would confess to a crime they didn't commit, but it's possible that Jeremy made up the story so he could be in the spotlight. He was apparently already on death row, so he may have felt like he could gain some attention while having nothing to lose. Then he may have enjoyed pulling the rug out from under the police by recanting. When 2009 rolled around, 10 years had elapsed, and the case still remained unsolved. In hopes of inspiring anyone with knowledge of the case to come forward, the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation offered up to $10,000 in reward for information that would lead to an arrest and conviction in the killings of Danny and Kathy Freeman. Still, no luck, and the case remained cold. Then, very unexpectedly, an intriguing development occurred at the beginning of 2017. There was a new sheriff in town, and he had come across a box that contained vital information. Authorities kept the items confidential, but a member of the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation divulged that the findings were extremely valuable, and the information provided a definite course in potentially solving the case. Everything was about to come out, and the details of the events of the night of the trailer fire and the days that followed were sure to disturb even the most seasoned of detectives. Potential witnesses that had been uncovered were tracked down and interviewed, and a tangled tale of evil began to unwind. Remember the insurance ID card that was found at the scene of the Freeman's fire-ravaged trailer? Well, the owner was located, and she provided valuable pieces of information that jump-started the case. At the time of the Freeman murders and disappearances of the girls, she had been the girlfriend of a man by the name of Phil Welch. Phil happened to live less than a mile from the Freemans at the time of the murders. A few months later, she claimed he'd been abusive toward her. She left her little old sedan behind and ended the relationship. Right after the first woman left Phil, another took her place. This woman would prove to provide groundbreaking information, and others would soon give accounts that paralleled those that she gave. During her interview, she told of conversations she'd overheard between Phil and two other men. She identified the others as David Pennington and Ronnie Dean Busick. She said that they talked about the people killed in Welch, Oklahoma over a drug debt. She'd heard the girls had been taken and eventually killed, and that Pennington and Busick had set the Freeman trailer ablaze. What she said next was shockingly evil. Phil had nailed a poster to his wall that featured a $50,000 reward for information in the disappearances of Ashley and Loria. The poster was a souvenir or reminder of what he'd done, and he was proud of it. But the poster wasn't the worst of it. She said Phil had Polaroid photos kept in a leather briefcase, and the images were horrifying. No question about it, the woman stated. The girls in the photos matched the images on the poster. In the pictures, their hands were tied and their mouths gagged. Leads that had rolled in around that time tied another woman to the case. She had lived with David, and she had also overheard disturbing conversations. In fact, she stated that she heard him talking about the girls all the time. David told her the girls were at the bottom of a pit, and he threatened to throw her in too if she told anyone what she'd heard. And the little car Phil's first girlfriend had left behind when she moved out of his place. She claimed that Phil had been using the car at the time of the killing, and that could explain why the first girlfriend's insurance card was found nearby. And then there was the third man, Ronnie. He'd been heard talking about the Freeman murders and the missing girls. Ronnie told an acquaintance about how the girls had been assaulted and tortured in a trailer in Pitcher and kept alive for several days. Ronnie named Phil as the shooter and said that he and David set the trailer fire after Phil left with the girls in the little old car. It may seem unfathomable that the two women connected to Phil and David had all of this information for years, but never reported it. However, they may have been afraid for their own lives, as they knew what the men were capable of. It's also possible that the women may have thought they would get in trouble for not going forward sooner. With this information, investigators believed it was time to go directly to the men at the center of the rumors: Phil, David, and Ronnie. However, there was a big problem. Well, two big problems to be exact. Phil had died in 2007 and David had died in 2015. That left just one. Things were about to get really bad for old Ronnie. In late April of 2018, Ronnie was arrested on 4 counts of murder, kidnapping, and arson. He was seen as more of an accessory than the mastermind, and he pleaded guilty to being an accessory to first-degree murder in mid-July of 2020. Ronnie had an option to have his proposed sentence reduced if he were to lead authorities to the remains of Ashley and Loria. The deal was that his 15-year sentence, 10 years in prison, and the remaining 5 years suspended would be reduced to 5 years behind bars if the remains of Ashley and Loria were successfully recovered. But there would be no such luck for Ronnie or the girls' families, as Ronnie was unable or unwilling to provide the location. On August 31st, Ronnie received the 15-year sentence. Loria's mother, Laureen, stated that she would not stop searching until the girls were brought home, and there's still a shred of hope that the girls' remains will be recovered.
911, what is the location of your emergency? Okay, hello?
Hello?
Yes, I need you to take a couple deep breaths so I can see what's going on.
My name is Russell Faria.
Russell, what's going on there?
I just got home from a friend's house, and my wife killed herself. She's on the floor.
Okay, Russell, I need you to calm down, honey, okay? We're going to get somebody on the way there, okay?
The frantic 911 call you just heard was made by Russell Faria just moments after he returned home to discover his wife Betsy's body. Betsy had been given months to live when her breast cancer spread to her liver, but it wasn't the cancer that killed her. Betsy and her husband Russ were married on January 21st, 2000. They lived in Troy, Missouri. Her sister described her as positive and upbeat, a shining light, and as a couple, Betsy and Russ seemed to be doing well considering her illness. A friend of Betsy's even described Russ as a loving and doting husband, but all of that would be thrown into question soon. At first, Betsy's cancer had gone into remission, and the couple planned a cruise for their family and friends as a celebration of life in November of 2011. Unfortunately, just 1 month before they were set to leave, they got the worst news imaginable. Betsy's cancer had spread to her liver, and worse than that, she only had a few more months to live. Still, they went ahead with the cruise and cherished their time together. But things were about to take a drastic turn south, and no one could have predicted how twisted things would get. It was a typical day on December 27th of 2011. Betsy attended morning chemotherapy with an old family friend, Bobby Wan, and Russ was going to pick her up later that night at her mother's after his weekly game night with friends. To Betsy's surprise, her close friend Pam Hupp showed up at treatment and offered to take Betsy home, even though the round trip for Pam would take a full hour. The ladies had met 10 years earlier through their work in insurance sales. Betsy accepted the generous offer. Little did she know, this would be her last trip home. Pam dropped Betsy off at home around 7 p.m. Pam placed a call to her husband Mark Hupp a few minutes later to let him know she was about to leave Betsy's house and would soon be home. He didn't answer, so Pam left a short message. Betsy chimed in with a quick Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. The call ended and Pam departed Betsy's house, headed for her own. Meanwhile, Russ's evening had been uneventful. His 5 friends had called it a night around 9, and Russ left and stopped off at an Arby's for a couple sandwiches. But Russ's life was about to change forever. He arrived home expecting to find Betsy asleep on the couch, but instead he discovered her lying on the living room floor near their couch, covered in blood. Russ frantically placed his 911 call at 9:40.
What did she do? Do you know?
She got a knife in her neck and she sliced her arms.
Okay, calm down, honey. Is she breathing at all?
No.
She is not breathing?
No, there's one. Come on. Okay.
The terror and raw emotion in Russ's voice are gut-wrenching as he tells the operator that his wife appeared to have taken her own life. His mind may have jumped to the conclusion that Betsy took her own life because of her cancer prognosis. It's not uncommon for people diagnosed with terminal illness to consider taking their own lives. But when the sheriff's deputy arrived at the scene less than 10 minutes later, it was obvious that something far more sinister had occurred. She had been stabbed repeatedly, her arms nearly severed, wrists slashed to the bone, the knife still protruding from her neck. Russ was escorted outside. An autopsy would reveal that 55 stab wounds covered her body. This is clear evidence of overkill and is an indication that the victim most likely knew the perpetrator. Around 11 p.m., a little over an hour after the sheriff's deputy arrived on the scene, he drove Russ to the Lincoln County Sheriff's Office for questioning. It was routine procedure. Russ was the spouse of the deceased, after all. But soon the tone changed, and the questioning turned into an interrogation that would last nearly 11 hours. A search of the Faria house uncovered blood on the couple's bedroom light switch plate and on a pair of Russ's slippers in the closet. Russ's game night friends were interviewed while he was interrogated, and they agreed with the timeline of events Russ had provided. But investigators weren't sure if they'd agreed on the night's events because they'd crafted a conspiratorial story, or if it was simply an accurate timeline. At about 6:40 the next morning, 2 detectives arrived to interview Betsy's friend Pam. She proved to be very helpful to the investigation. 4 days prior to Betsy's stabbing, Betsy had changed the beneficiary on a $150,000 life insurance policy from Russ to Pam. According to Pam, Russ and Betsy's daughters couldn't be trusted to handle the funds, so Pam agreed to manage funds for Betsy's daughters. Pam also claimed Betsy had told her that Russ was physically abusive. The doting husband was starting to sound more like a heartless bully. Russ was released after being in police custody for nearly 24 hours, but his freedom was only temporary. He was arrested on January 4, 2012, the day after Betsy's funeral, on charges of first-degree murder and armed criminal action. For the following 22 months, Russ sat in prison awaiting trial, which finally began in late November of 2013. Jurors listened as the prosecution built quite a case against Russ. They proposed that Russ had been driven by rage when he discovered life policy paperwork that had been left on the kitchen counter. As well, prosecution suggested that Russ had left his phone at his friend's place during game night, made the 30-minute commute back to the Faria home, murdered Betsy, and then a loyal friend from the group delivered his phone along with an Arby's receipt later that night in an effort to mislead investigators. When the 911 call was played for the jury, prosecution also argued that Russ's emotions were over the top and insincere, saying he was faking his reaction to Betsy's brutalized body. And then there were the slippers. The blood on Russ's slippers found in the bedroom closet was damning, no doubt about it. When Pam was called to testify as witness for the prosecution, she reinforced the argument that the Faria marriage wasn't the happy one it appeared to be. Not happy at all. And as beneficiary of the $150,000, Hupp testified that she had set up a trust for the girls in the amount of $100,000. As for the other $50,000, Betsy asked that it be set aside to help a friend's daughter, a 12-year-old child whose mother had recently died of cancer. The jury deliberated for about 4 hours, and it was no surprise that Russ was found guilty of the heinous crime. A month later, Russ received a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. End of story, right? Not at all. After the dust settled from the conclusion of the trial, some of the questions about Betsy's murder were anything but answered. It turns out that the jury had not been permitted to hear facts that Russ's attorney Joel Schwartz was certain would have changed the outcome of the trial. Because of this, Russ was granted a retrial on June 5, 2015. In fact, the presiding judge went so far as to describe the original trial as rather disturbing. Just 2 weeks prior to the retrial, a shocking bombshell was dropped. A forensic expert found a document on a Faria computer. It seemed to be an email Pam had mentioned to police a few years earlier, and it detailed Betsy's fears concerning Russ. In the email, she wrote that she felt he was going to harm her and mentioned an incident where Russ allegedly held a pillow over her face. She asked Pam if she would serve as beneficiary to Betsy's life policy, so Pam could handle funds for Betsy's daughters. With this new evidence, the retrial was going to be a challenging battle. November 2, 2015 arrived, and the trial commenced. Once again, the prosecution painted Russ as the abusive husband and Betsy the fearful victim. The defense stated that it appeared Betsy had been dead for some time when Russ discovered her body, and testimony of a paramedic supported the claim, saying that she was cold and stiff to the touch upon his arrival at the scene. However, Russ's lawyer also introduced a new potential suspect, and it was none other than, you guessed it, Pam Hupp. She was the last to see Betsy after all. Some peculiar things about Pam were about to emerge. There were inconsistencies in Pam's previous accounts of the evening. Initially, she'd stated she hadn't gone inside Betsy's home. On another occasion, she said she'd stuck around at Betsy's for 20 minutes. At trial, she testified she was back home by 7:27. Phone records showed that she had called Betsy at that time, but why? And why didn't Betsy answer the call? Most importantly, as indicated by cell phone records, why was Pam still within 3 miles of Betsy's home when she placed the call? Perhaps the strangest, most unbelievable twist was a police officer's testimony that during the previous summer, Pam had described her and Betsy as, get this, lovers. According to Pam, they'd been engaged in a secret romantic relationship for 10 years. And boy, had Russ been angry when he'd found out. Then the document found on the Faria computer was introduced. Not a great development for Russ. Or was it? The defense expert testified that the letter had been planted 5 days before Betsy was murdered. It was the only document on the computer with an unknown author, and it had been created in a word processing program the computer didn't even have. Interesting. So if Betsy hadn't written the email, who had? Russ's bloody slippers were also addressed, but a CSI who had investigated the scene testified that the slippers looked like they'd been dipped in blood, not worn through a bloody path. On top of this, cell phone records, receipts, and even merchant footage backed up Russ's account of the evening as he ran errands and grabbed his Arby's meal. On November 6, 2015, the judge decided the case. This time, Russ was acquitted. But a very important question still remained. If Russ hadn't killed Betsy, who had? Russ's lawyer literally couldn't rest. He was losing sleep over the murder despite his client's acquittal. Prosecuting attorney Askey had no intention of pursuing any other suspect, but Schwartz's gut told him that someone else was going to die. An ominous prediction that would soon prove true. In what seemed to be a completely unrelated event, on August 16, 2016, Pam was in her car in her driveway when a strange man confronted her. She jumped out of the car and rushed into her home, but the man followed her inside.
911, what's your emergency? Hey, hello, there's someone breaking in my house. Help! What's the address you're at? Help!
Woman, can you woman get your what?
I'm getting in the car with you. No,
What's the address?
Get out, get out, get out.
Then, 5 shots rang out. Pam's flat tone in this clip is somewhat strange. She doesn't appear to be expressing much emotion despite the situation. It almost sounds as if she's reading from a script. This type of scenario should trigger a fight or flight response, which is the body's way of coping with extreme stress or danger, and is usually expressed by yelling, screaming, or crying, all of which is the opposite of Pam. Pam told police about how the intruder had tried to kidnap her to get Russ's money and yelled that he was going to kill her. That's when she'd located her revolver, pointed, and shot him. Following the questioning, Pam was released, but in time, the truth would be exposed, and in a way no one could have imagined. About a week later, St. Charles County prosecutors and investigators announced that further investigation had led them to develop their own theory. It went something like this. Pam needed to divert attention from herself, as it was known that Betsy's case was being reinvestigated. She tried to make it look like she'd been attacked by an assassin sent by Russ, then shot the man in self-defense. And Joel's prediction of another casualty had sadly proven correct. Pam was finally arrested. Footage shows Pam being questioned, then grabbing a pen and tucking it into her clothing behind her back. She requests a trip to the restroom. Suddenly, chaos erupts at the police station.
There's an officer here, a female officer that's going to escort to the back. Okay.
Pam has attempted to take her life by inflicting injuries to her neck and wrists using the pen she'd hidden. Authorities believed Pam's bizarre attempt to take her life was an indication of her guilt in the killing of the alleged intruder. He was identified as 33-year-old Louis Gumpenberger, who was mentally and physically disabled due to a horrific car crash in 2005. It definitely didn't do Pam any favors when cell phone records indicated a ping near the home Louis shared with his mother and son just 45 minutes before she placed the 911 call. The call seemed like nothing more than a terrible performance on Pam's part. And how had Lewis made the 13-mile commute to Pam's home? He rarely left his apartment, with the exception of brief walks with his mother. Furthermore, in Lewis's pocket were 9 $100 bills. It just so happened that 4 of the bills were sequential to a $100 bill located in Pam's dresser. An unlikely coincidence, don't you think? A strange note was discovered in Lewis's pocket. It seemed to be a pitiful attempt to incriminate him, but it was quite obviously planted. Then a chilling piece of information surfaced. Lewis wasn't the only person Pam had allegedly tried to lure into her vehicle. 6 days before his death, a police report was filed by a woman who'd been approached by a Dateline producer at her home in St. Charles County. The offer was enticing. She would be paid $1,000 by the producer for simply reenacting a 911 call for the show. But her instincts told her something wasn't quite right. She'd made the mistake of getting into the car and quickly told the woman to take her back home. The woman did, and a home security camera captured footage of the 2016 Acadia and the license plate. The vehicle was found to belong to, yes, Pam Hupp. On August 12, 2019, Pam was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the killing of Lewis. The death penalty was taken off the table when Pam entered an Alford plea. An Alford plea is where there is strong evidence of guilt, but a defendant doesn't have to actually admit to the crime in order to plead guilty and accept a plea bargain. This is often done in an attempt to avoid the worst possible sentence for the crime. In July of 2021, yet another outrageous twist in this strange tale occurred. At long last, Pam was formally charged with first-degree murder in the death of Betsy Faria. Perhaps after all of the years since Betsy's death, justice could be on the horizon for family and friends of the woman whose life was cut short. That's how this story ends for now. But before we go, I'll leave you with one more intriguing tidbit. Pam's mother, 77-year-old Shirley Newman, died about 2 years after Betsy's murder in 2013, years before Pam was arrested. But the cause of death was anything but natural. She fell from her apartment balcony 3 floors up. Apparently, she had a large amount of Ambien in her system. The cause of death was ruled undetermined. It's alleged that Pam was the last person to see Shirley alive. Was it simply an accident, or something more sinister? Perhaps we'll never know. Here are some red flags from this case. For one, it was a red flag that Betsy changed her life insurance beneficiary to Pam only a few days before she died. The fact that Pam changed her story several times about whether she went inside the house or not should have set off some alarm bells. The phone call that she made to her husband as she was leaving, in which Betsy can be heard in the background, could have been a very strategic move to provide proof that Betsy was alive when Pam allegedly left. Pam's very strange 911 call before shooting Lewis. It's possible that she was overly confident, thinking her story would be believed, so she didn't need to put in much effort to convincing the dispatcher. How to avoid similar situations. One big takeaway from this case is to remember that money can affect people in different ways, and greed can be a very dangerous thing. If someone is trying to persuade you to make changes about who will inherit your money or about increasing the amount of your life insurance, do not make any rash decisions, even if this person makes convincing points.